We are not limited by what we are, but by what others stop believing we can become. A 5-year-old child constantly asks, "Why?" until adults grow tired. A few years later, that same child sits silently in the classroom, never raising a hand, never wondering what happened. Did the questions vanish, or did the system simply make asking them too risky? We often think of potential as a personal asset you either have or don't. But what if that's a mistake? What if what truly determines a person's growth isn't within themselves, but within the invisible structures they live alongside? Who listens to them? Who teaches them? Who believes in them? Who gives them space to try and to fail? How many lives are lost, not due to a lack of will, but because the system fails to open its doors in time? How many people develop too slowly to be considered promising? How many talents are simply different in their learning style and are discarded for not conforming? This book begins with a suspicion that the criteria we use to measure human ability might actually be limiting that very ability. And that potential, instead of being a pre-existing blueprint in our DNA, might be an outcome born from properly designed structures, context, and belief. If you've ever felt judged too soon or seen others dismissed too easily, perhaps now is the time to reevaluate what potential truly is and who has the right to cultivate it. William James, the father of modern psychology, once declared that human character would set like plaster after the age of 30. He couldn't have known that a century later in West Africa, thousands of middle-aged entrepreneurs would quietly prove him wrong. In an experiment involving over 1,500 men and women running small businesses, researchers divided them into 3 groups. The first group received no intervention. The second received classical business management training, finance, accounting, marketing, human resources. The third group was different. They didn't learn how to manage money, but how to manage themselves. They were trained to be proactive, persistent, and disciplined, what people often call soft skills, or more accurately, character skills. The results stunned even the scientists. After only 5 days of training, the character skills group saw their profits increase by an average of 30% within 2 years, 3 times more than the group trained in traditional business skills. These entrepreneurs didn't just learn how to react to the market, they learned how to actively create it. They didn't just solve financial problems, they learned how to resiliently navigate setbacks. They weren't simply hard workers, they became intelligent and steadfast workers. William James, despite his genius, was mistaken. Human character doesn't set, it's malleable and can be refined throughout life. This is the premise for this entire book. That potential is not limited by innate talent, but expanded by skills that seem softest yet are the most enduring. A power often underestimated, yet it is the foundation for anyone to go further than their initial starting point. It begins with a young woman named Sarah Maria H. In the eyes of outsiders, Sarah was a language prodigy. She spoke 5 languages fluently and 4 others conversationally. But few knew that as a child, Sarah struggled with Spanish, her father's native language. Despite 6 years of schooling, she couldn't speak it fluently and was even doubted by her teachers about her language ability. To the point that her father, a fluent English speaker, gently told his daughter, "Perhaps Spanish isn't for you, and you don't need it to live in America." Sarah believed that until she started interacting with a community of people called polyglots, those who know many languages. She discovered that they didn't necessarily have special genes or superhuman brains. What they had was the ability to embrace the awkwardness that everyone hates, saying things wrong, being laughed at, misunderstood, rejected. They learned quickly not because they were smarter, but because they were willing to look foolish longer than others. Sarah recounted that when learning a new language, she didn't wait until she was ready, but spoke from day one, even if it was wrong, stammering, or clumsy. She called it bathing in the feeling of cluelessness, because to her, shame was proof of progress. This idea sounds simple but is paradoxical. To become proficient, you must dare to be unproficient. You must dare to try, even if wrong, dare to act, even if you fail, dare to immerse yourself, even if you look silly. If you think this only applies to learning foreign languages, meet Steve Martin, the legendary comedian. He once said he had no innate talent for comedy. He started his career with performances where the audience threw drinks at him. There were even nights when he stood on stage for 20 minutes without a single laugh. But he persisted, and what helped him overcome wasn't talent, but learning to write, a skill he absolutely hated. He accepted learning what caused him the most pain because it was what he needed most to get better. In psychology, this is called emotional courage, the ability to endure discomfort to push past personal limits. Steve Martin wrote not because he liked it, but because he knew it was the only path to improvement. And then the strange thing happened. Writing, from being a source of pain, became his sharpest tool. Through writing, he learned how to condense, refine, and structure comedy. Through writing, he learned how to create punchlines that made thousands roar with laughter. But learning in pain doesn't mean learning the wrong way. A big mistake in education today is the myth of learning styles. People believe that someone learns better if they learn in a suitable style, visual, auditory, kinesthetic. But research shows the opposite. The style you prefer isn't the style you learn most effectively. You learn most effectively when you're willing to step out of your comfort zone. Try reading a book instead of listening to a podcast. If you find reading harder, try writing down your thoughts instead of just thinking them in your head. Because that very feeling of awkwardness when learning is a sign that you're digging deeper. When learning a language, what matters isn't how many words you remember, but daring to use the wrong words. In an experiment, people who deliberately guessed wrong answers before knowing the right ones remembered longer than those who guessed correctly or didn't guess at all. This is because guessing wrong makes the brain pay more attention and learn better. That's why Benny Lewis, another polyglot, aims to make 200 mistakes a day when learning a new language. He doesn't count the correct sentences, he counts the times he speaks incorrectly, because for him, every mistake is a step forward. I used to think effective learning meant not making mistakes. But now I believe that true learning begins when you bravely allow yourself to make mistakes. When we talk about learning, our minds usually associate it with receiving, acquiring knowledge, absorbing skills, internalizing mindsets. But in Chapter 2, I want to lead you to a more unusual image, the sponge. You might be thinking of a wet, lifeless dish sponge, but I want to refer to a real creature, the deep-sea sponge, living at the bottom of the ocean for millions of years, surviving many mass extinctions. It has no eyes, no mouth, no nerves or muscles, yet it persists and thrives. They don't simply absorb. They filter, remove toxins, and notably, when damaged, they can regenerate from their own cells. Humans can also be like sponges, but not everyone is. Some people live like rubber, impacted but responding rigidly. Others are like Teflon, nothing sticks to them. Some only learn when someone molds them like clay, meaning they need others to guide them. But a few have the ability to seek, filter, and develop themselves. They are living sponges, actively absorbing, actively transforming. Melody Hobson is one such person. She grew up in poverty. A single mother, utilities often cut off. Many times they were evicted for not being able to pay rent. In first grade, Melody still couldn't read. She was placed in a class for struggling students. But a few years later, she was not only reading fluently but became a top student, winning scholarships to Princeton, where a boarding school was later named after her. You might think Melody's success came from hard work. Yes, she was incredibly diligent. But the key lies in how she learned to learn. She learned to absorb information like an intelligent sponge, filtering, critiquing, connecting. When she was invited for an internship at John Rogers' investment firm, she didn't just work. She soaked up the entire intellectual atmosphere around her, meeting her boss at McDonald's on Saturday mornings to read financial newspapers. She questioned every small detail, noting down every word. John recounted, "She learned about the market so fast, I couldn't keep up." Science calls this ability absorptive capacity, the capacity to assimilate knowledge. Not everyone has it. It requires two factors. First, actively seeking information, not just passively receiving what comes to you. Second, the goal of learning is self-development, not ego-boosting. Conversely, some people learn to prove themselves, not to improve. They only select information that reinforces their ego, dismissing anything that contradicts it. As a result, they get stuck in their own bubble, hearing what they want to hear, learning what they already know, and ultimately learning nothing at all. The journey to becoming a living sponge requires proactivity, even when no one is teaching you. That was the case for a Kenyan athlete named Julius Yego. In a poor village without electricity or cars, Julius had only one passion: javelin throwing. But he had no coach, no training field, no equipment. While his main competitor, Ihab Abdulrahman from Egypt, was taller, stronger, and trained by top experts, Julius taught himself from YouTube. That's right, he went to an internet cafe, watched videos of world-class athletes competing over and over, then practiced himself. The result: he defeated Ihab, set a national record, and won a world medal. He had no innate advantages. He had the initiative to learn and an incredibly selective absorptive capacity. He watched, analyzed, mimicked, then adjusted to fit his own body, rather than mechanically copying. He was a sponge with a sophisticated filter. Effective learning isn't about learning a lot, but about learning the right things. Not learning everything, but filtering what's worth learning and eliminating distractions. I once made this mistake in my own career when I started teaching at university. I would often end my lectures by asking students, "Do you have any feedback?" Most of them would smile, "Great job, professor." I thought I was doing fine, until a group of honest students told me I sounded like Darth Vader, trembling and gasping for breath. Then a hiring committee rejected me, citing a lack of confidence in the classroom. That's when I understood, feedback isn't useful unless you know how to ask for it correctly. Instead of asking, "How did you find the lecture?" I switched to, "If you could change just one thing to make the class more effective, what would it be?" Just one question, and students started telling the truth. Some told me not to start with bland jokes. Others advised telling a personal story first to connect. Those suggestions didn't hurt me, they woke me up. The further I went, the more I learned. Effective learning doesn't come from knowing a lot, but from knowing what you don't know. And no one helped me understand that more than a man named Bill Bradley, a former NBA player and U.S. Senator. He once told a young woman named Melody Hobson that she was smart, but if she didn't learn to pass the ball, she would become a solo act. The girl cried, but instead of getting angry, she told herself, "If I cry, he'll never give me feedback again." And she changed, not out of fear, but because she knew he was telling the truth. He cared, understood her well, and was close enough to say what she needed to hear. Later, he not only mentored her into the investment world, but also walked her down the aisle on her wedding day. Sincere feedback, if chosen correctly, can become a lifelong guide. When we think of exceptional people, we often imagine perfection, individuals with natural talent, flawless, smooth as marble. But in Chapter 3, I want to tell you about a strange group of people, those who never try to be perfect. They are the imperfectists. It might sound like an excuse for laziness, but the truth is the opposite. Imperfectists aren't sloppy. They are free from the pressure of perfection, daring to try, daring to fail, daring to stop when needed, and daring to correct themselves without shame. When you try to do everything perfectly, you tend to avoid failure, avoid risk, and even avoid learning. Because learning means admitting you're not good enough. And so, you stop progressing. In a study of over 400 artists and scientists, those who reached the pinnacle weren't always the ones who were right, but the ones who extended their trial and error period. They didn't choose the first seemingly logical option, but tried many absurd, contradictory, quirky ones until a breakthrough idea emerged. They didn't pursue immediate correctness, but embraced the messiness of thought. Beethoven didn't write a masterpiece in one go. He sketched dozens of drafts for a single musical passage, trying again and again. Darwin took over 20 years to publish his theory of evolution, not because he was slow, but because he wanted to be sure he wasn't deceiving himself. Jazz artist Miles Davis once said, "There are no wrong notes, only wrong reactions." This means you shouldn't fear making mistakes. You just need to know how to react when you do. And to do that, you need to restructure your relationship with failure. That's what Ashley Merriman, an education researcher, discovered when surveying high schools in the U.S. The best students were often those who had never failed or were shielded from failure. They did well on tests, but when faced with an unfamiliar question, they froze. In contrast, students who had received low grades, who had failed but continued to learn, tended to be more curious, persistent, and flexible. Perfection, it turns out, makes us vulnerable to uncertainty. That's why a group of teachers in New Zealand decided to teach students to misspell words. They called it the spelling error experiment. Instead of grading errors, they encouraged students to write out difficult words and guess their spelling, then compare them to the correct way. The goal wasn't to avoid mistakes, but to become familiar with being wrong in order to gradually correct themselves. As a result, students remembered words longer, understood phonetic rules more clearly, and were no longer afraid to write. It's similar to product design, where engineers call it prototype thinking. Don't try to make a perfect product from the start. Make a draft, Fail as early as possible to learn as quickly as possible. A prototype is an invitation. Go ahead and fail, but fail strategically. In psychology, this state is called self-compassion. It's not about easily forgiving yourself, but about being kind to yourself when facing failure. Instead of scolding yourself, how stupid. Someone with self-compassion will ask, what did I learn from this? It sounds easy, but it's hard to practice, especially for perfectionists. I once met a student like that. She always got high grades but stumbled during a presentation. Afterward, she didn't dare to speak another word in class. When I asked her about it, she said, "I'm afraid people will think I'm not good enough." I asked back, "If you think you're not good enough, would you dare to practice more?" She was silent. That's when I realized that the fear of failure doesn't just hold us back, it steals our opportunities to learn. I told her about a study with athletes. Those who had self-compassion after failure recovered and trained again faster and performed better. This is because they weren't stuck in self-blame. They moved on, and that's what matters. It's not mistakes that kill potential, but stopping after making them. In Japan, there's a tradition called kintsugi, repairing broken pottery with gold. They don't hide the cracks, they highlight them with gold, making them part of the story, part of the beauty. A bowl that has been broken and repaired is more precious than an intact one because it has endured time and been remade. Human potential is the same. It doesn't lie in pristine perfection, but in the ability to rebuild after breakage. That's why this chapter ends with a paradox. The person who isn't afraid of imperfection is the one who truly perfects themselves. There's a strange thing about how humans evaluate each other. We are very good at recognizing talent in others, but very bad at predicting who will go far. Resumes, degrees, grades can give us a glimpse of current ability, but they are terrible at measuring future potential. Therefore, instead of trying to measure the starting point, we should learn to assess the ability to learn something deeper but more sustainable. That's why creative organizations, from tech companies to sports teams, are starting to pay attention to an unusual capacity, the ability to learn as a way of life. It's not about who learns better than whom, it's about who knows how to learn from themselves. Meet Mike Renos. He used to be a race car design engineer, then moved on to managing an aircraft manufacturing plant. One day, he was tasked with retraining all the employees in an old, low-productivity workshop. Instead of teaching them new techniques, he did something simple. He installed cameras to record how they worked. Then he watched the videos with them, asking, "What could we do differently?" There was no curriculum, no scorecard, just the question, is there a better way? And something magical happened. Employees started identifying their own mistakes. They didn't feel criticized, but felt trusted because they were the ones finding the solutions, not someone imposing them from above. After only a few months, efficiency increased by 20%. A year later, the factory achieved record quality and productivity. What Mike did wasn't new, but how he empowered others to learn was entirely different. He didn't teach, he helped others see for themselves. That's the core of learning agility. Not learning fast, but daring to learn from what we don't know and aren't good at. But to learn like that requires an essential element, a safe space to make mistakes. Imagine playing a game where every mistake is punished. You wouldn't dare to try anymore. Conversely, if every mistake is an opportunity to understand more deeply, you'll dare to do more. That's why in high-performing teams, from hospitals to flight crews, a culture of psychological safety is created, where you can voice your mistakes without fear of shame. No one sees you as weak if you admit to making a mistake. On the contrary, they see it as a sign of someone growing. At Google, the most creative teams aren't those with the most geniuses, but those where everyone feels heard, not judged, and can give feedback to each other without causing offense. The question isn't who is smarter. The question is who is willing to learn from their own mistakes and those of others. There's a way to test that. Ask someone, what was something you got wrong recently? If they can't remember anything, perhaps they've shut down their ability to grow. In my career, I once interviewed an extremely intelligent candidate. Perfect resume, sharp answers. But when I asked, what's the biggest false assumption you've ever believed? She hesitated, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she wasn't used to thinking that way. The ability to question oneself isn't about shattering the ego, but about re-establishing a new ego, flexible, humble, and willing to relearn. These are character skills that aren't easily seen, but are the foundation of all sustainable progress. That's also why many advanced hiring programs don't just rely on scores, but include an assessment of attitude toward learning. They don't ask what you know, but when was the last time you changed your mind and why? Answering that question isn't easy, but if you have a real story, you've gone much further than many. And finally, character skills cannot be learned just once. They are like muscles, they must be trained continuously. Courage, humility, discipline, curiosity are not innate qualities, but capacities that can be forged through small actions. An educator once said, "Every action is a vote you cast for the person you want to become." Each time you choose to learn instead of avoid, to ask instead of guess, to try instead of wait, you are casting a vote for a better version of yourself. And that is the most important thing I learned on this journey of discovering hidden potential. Character is not something you have. Character is something you cultivate over decades. Modern education still focuses heavily on two aspects: intelligence and knowledge, scores, exams, certificates. Everything revolves around measuring academic ability. But looking back, the people who reach the pinnacle in science, art, and business are often not the best on paper, but the most persistent, resilient, and enduring. That's why a group of researchers decided to investigate which factor better predicts success: IQ or character. They tracked hundreds of students over many years. The surprising result: persistence, not intelligence, was the decisive factor in achieving long-term goals. Character, seemingly subtle, is what extends the effects of ability. But cultivating character isn't like learning a math formula. It is no absolute correct answer. It requires vitality, friction, experience, and especially feedback from others. In a Chicago high school, a group of teachers decided to teach students how to listen to feedback without defensiveness. Students were assigned to record a moment when someone pointed out their mistake and their initial emotion. Most wrote anger, shame, wanting to resist. But then they were asked, was that true? Once allowed to admit mistakes without shame, students began actively asking for feedback even before being prompted. Teachers didn't just teach knowledge. They created a safe moral space where students weren't afraid to lose face when daring to change. Similarly, in another study, when students were taught that the ability to receive feedback was a sign of a progressive learner, they were more willing to constructively critique others' work and also received more useful feedback themselves. They no longer played social games, but sincerely helped each other grow. This brings us to a deeper concept. Feedback is not just a tool for correction, but the material for forging character. But for feedback to be valuable, it must come from people you trust and an environment where you feel safe. Think about the people who told you what you didn't want to hear, but later you thanked them. They didn't speak to diminish you, but to remind you that you could be more. When I was a freshman, a professor once told me directly, "Your writing is fluent, but too shallow." I felt like a dagger had been plunged into my self-esteem, but he didn't abandon me. He gave me more challenging materials, invited me to an intensive reading group, and made me rewrite an essay many times. It wasn't until I understood Einstein's metaphor in the theory of relativity that I understood. He had set me on a journey to explore depths of thought I had never imagined. Expectation coupled with care can change a person's life. From then on, I began to believe that the way we grow is not by avoiding painful feedback, but by learning to stay with it long enough for it to open doors for us. If you want to improve your skills in any field, find someone who isn't afraid to point out your weaknesses and is close enough to understand you. They are the ones who give you the right mix of challenge and support. I call that emotional scaffolding, not coddling nor abandoning, but building a temporary system to help you climb higher than your current ability. Top athletes have coaches who know when to push and when to stop. Talented artists have mentors who know when to criticize and when to encourage. And each of us, if we are lucky, needs someone like that in our lives. Potential is not something someone is born with. Potential is something that emerges when you are taught to believe in it. And so, we arrive at the final conclusion of this section. Character skills are like an invisible thread connecting our inner and outer selves. They start from within: perseverance, proactivity, self-compassion. But they also grow through others, through feedback, through expectations, through timely support. They are not inherent qualities. They are the result of living in conditions that allow people to truly grow. We used to believe that talent was God-given, but now we know that resilience can be learned. And if you want to go far, not just in your career but in your character as a human being, start with the things no one sees on a report card. how you react when you make a mistake, how you continue when discouraged, and how you listen when others help you see yourself more clearly. That's not the fast path, but it is the long and certain path. In the world of professional athletes, the ability to endure pain is not a gift, but something that is trained. Some train in silence, some train in the fear of being left behind, some train by turning boredom into ritual. In this chapter, I want to recount how the most persistent people in the world don't always have motivation. They simply have a structure so they don't need motivation to keep going. Everyone knows that running a marathon is hard, but very few consider that the hardest part of training isn't the pain, but the repetition. Imagine running 20 kilometers every morning, with no one cheering, no applause, no medal, just the sound of your shoes hitting the pavement and your breath puffing in the cold. Inspiration isn't present in the morning, it sleeps in and wakes late. Yet some still get up, put on their shoes, and hit the road. What makes them do it? For years, we've been taught to find intrinsic motivation, passion, aspiration, ideals. But the reality is that intrinsic motivation is unstable. Some days you're full of inspiration, some days everything feels meaningless. If you wait for emotion to act, you'll never go far. So instead of just asking, how do I get motivated? I started asking a different question. How do I keep acting even when there's no motivation? The answer, as I discovered, lies in structure. Structure here isn't a rigid schedule or external command. It's a network of deliberate choices, commitments, and contexts designed to propel you forward. Take a simple example. A study at Penn State University showed that if you commit to working out with a friend at a fixed time, your likelihood of keeping that appointment is 3 times higher than if you work out alone. There's nothing magical about the promise itself. The magic is that you bind yourself to a system with consequences. If you don't go, you disappoint someone else. And sometimes, not wanting to let others down is the strongest reason to overcome yourself. But motivational structure doesn't just come from external sources, it can also come from how you redefine the experience. Let's go back to the example of a high school math teacher in New York. Every year, he encountered a group of students who had fallen behind, hated math, and thought they would never understand it. Instead of trying to convince them that math was important, he did something unusual. He had them play detective. Math problems were no longer just numbers. They became a case, each equation a clue. To find the culprit, they had to solve it. They started to care, then became passionate, and finally became good. Motivation doesn't always need to be found. Often, it needs to be redesigned. Psychologists call this cognitive reframing of goals. What you're doing might not change, but if you change why you think you're doing it, the experience changes color. In a classic study with nurses in a hospital, one group was reminded that their job was to take temperatures and blood pressure. The other group was reminded that they were helping patients recover faster. There was no difference in tasks, only in perspective. As a result, the second group worked more diligently, reported more accurately, and felt less tired. A sense of purpose can turn repetition into meaning, fatigue into a sign of value, and ordinary work into part of something larger. And when you see meaning in what you do, you need less motivation. You act because it's the right thing to do, without needing to feel enthusiastic. I once taught a soft skills class to first-year students. In the 4th session, a student came up to me afterward. He said, "I don't understand why they keep making us learn about habits, feedback, setting goals. I just want to be an engineer." I asked, "What kind of person do you think an engineer is?" He replied, "Someone good at math, logical, efficient." I nodded. Then I told him about an aerospace engineer who worked at Boeing who discovered that a small error in the inspection process, because no one dared to give feedback, had stalled a project for months. Afterward, the company set up an anonymous feedback program, but those who dared to give feedback were still looked at with suspicion by colleagues. So, the real skill they needed wasn't just checking data, but creating an environment where feedback was welcomed. The student was silent, then nodded, without me needing to convince him further. Because the purpose of learning had been reframed. That's what behavioral designers know very well. How you frame an experience can determine whether you continue or give up. One day, I received an email from a former student. The first line read, "I apologize for dropping your class midway." But then he recounted that a few years later, he started revisiting his old notes and was surprised to realize that what he once found most boring, learning how to give effective feedback, was now helping him immensely in his job. He was a product manager, and most of his time was spent communicating with customers, teammates, engineers. He wrote, "I think my motivation to learn back then wasn't enough because I didn't see myself needing it. Now I see it, but it's a pity it's too late." I don't think he was wrong. I think the structure around him wasn't enough to help him see the meaning. That's what many organizations still don't understand. Motivation is not a personal trait, it's a product of the environment. Think about rigorous selection systems like medical schools, military training courses, or large investment firms. There, people often praise those with extraordinary willpower. But observing closely, you'll see something different. Persistent people aren't those with the most passion, but those who know how to break down persistence into small enough time units to overcome. They don't run a marathon by thinking, "I'll run 42 kilometers." They think, "I just need to get to that lamppost." Then they think, "Now to that sign." They divide the journey into such small segments that each time they overcome one, it's just a tiny nudge. This is a strategy I call breaking the resistance space. In the brain, any difficult action, waking up early, writing an email, learning a new language, begins with a short-term resistance force. If you can break through it in the first 5 minutes, the rest becomes easier. That's why the 5-minute technique is so effective. Instead of trying to force yourself to complete a big task, you just say, "I'll do this for 5 minutes only." The brain accepts it more easily because it doesn't feel threatened. Then you start. And once you're in the groove, you usually do more than 5 minutes. Large behaviors are built from small commitments. Small commitments are maintained by environmental cues. A study with thousands of fitness app users showed that those who maintained their exercise habits longest weren't the ones who made the most detailed plans, but the ones who did it at the same time every day in the same location. This means the behavior was anchored to a specific context, like brushing teeth before bed or playing jazz music every time you make coffee. These cues are called triggers, the starting points of behavior. If you place your running shoes right by your bedroom door, the chance you'll go for a run the next morning significantly increases, not because you have more motivation, but because you have an additional reminder. In other words, you don't need to be stronger. You need to reorganize your environment so you don't need to be too strong. But not everyone has control over their environment. Many grow up in unsupportive contexts, unencouraging families, dismissive schools, communities lacking belief. And precisely because of this, these individuals need a temporary scaffolding structure even more to survive and grow. Let's return to a study in Nigeria. Thousands of small entrepreneurs were divided into 2 groups. One group learned classical business skills, accounting, management, marketing. The other group learned about psychology, motivation, proactivity, persistence, and risk-taking. 2 years later, the second group had profits 3 times higher than the first. It wasn't that they were smarter, but that they were given a different model for seeing the world. They learned to turn failure into feedback, to distinguish between objective difficulties and subjective fears, to maintain habits not by willpower, but by mechanism. Each person designed a focus corner for themselves, scheduled work according to energy cycles instead of the clock, set a 10-minute rule for things they hated to maintain important habits. They didn't wait for inspiration, they proactively arranged it. And that's the big difference between someone who has motivation and someone who has a motivation-generating structure. The former lives by emotion, the latter by system. I used to believe that resilience was forged in hardship. Now I believe that resilience is activated by the right structures, at the right time, in the right way, with the right people. When we think of the most persistent people, we often imagine them as solitary figures, struggling alone, fighting battles by themselves, needing no one by their side. But in reality, what keeps a person going during the most desolate phases of their journey is often someone else. In the research of psychologist Angela Duckworth, a pioneer in the concept of grit, one recurring factor among persistent individuals is the expectation from others, not pressure, but the feeling that someone believes in them, even when they don't yet believe in themselves. That's why mentoring programs, personal coaching, have such a long-lasting impact on the behavior and direction of students and even working professionals. No need for a hollow pep talk, just someone willing to ask a serious question. What are you striving for? And patient enough to listen to the entire answer, even if it's messy. The true power of a mentor lies not in providing solutions, but in keeping the other person engaged with the question. In modern society, everything pushes us to quickly know who we are. But those who develop far are often those who dare to stay longer in the undefined zone. And in that undefined zone, sometimes what we need is not a map, but a companion who won't leave. Researchers at Yale University once conducted an experiment. They asked participants to immerse their hands in painfully cold water. Those who did it alone often gave up after a few tens of seconds. But if a friend sat nearby, not needing to say anything, just being present, the endurance time nearly doubled. Unspoken presence is a little discussed scaffolding structure, but has a significant impact on motivation and behavior. So what happens if we don't have a companion? Then we need to build a replica of that companion in our own minds. That's why the imaginary mentor technique is applied in many personal development programs. Participants are asked to visualize someone they respect. It could be a real person, a historical figure, or an ideal archetype, and ask themselves, if that person were here, what would they want me to do? At first, it might sound silly, but surprisingly, this technique activates similar brain regions as receiving actual feedback. This means we don't need a real person, just a sufficiently clear mental presence. And once that image is firmly built, it becomes part of our internal structure, helping us shape our behavior even when no one is watching. I once conducted this exercise with a group of final year students. I asked them to write a letter to their best future selves, 5 years from now, then print it, put it in an envelope, and mail it back to themselves on graduation day. Many initially didn't see the point, but a few years later, they recounted that those letters helped them overcome moments of doubt because they reminded them of what they had committed to themselves. Motivational systems don't need to be grand. Sometimes it's a small piece of paper, a timely question, a trusting glance. But what if trust from others doesn't come, or comes too late, or worse, we once had it and it vanished? Then what keeps us going? I asked this question to a man who had been incarcerated for 13 years. When asked what kept him from giving up, he replied, "I didn't want others to decide who I was." In a world where everything was controlled, from time to his name, he held on to one thing: the right to redefine himself. Every morning, he wrote in a journal, not to complain, but to record a small action he would take that day to become the person he wanted to be. Sometimes it was helping a fellow prisoner learn to read, sometimes it was cleaning the yard, sometimes it was just sitting silently and not getting angry when insulted. He didn't write for anyone's recognition. He wrote to remind himself that he still had the power to choose. And that power of choice, however small, was the most minimalist structure of motivation. Your freedom might be taken away, but if you retain the ability to choose how to act, you still have the opportunity to create meaning. Looking back at the people I interviewed, from athletes, teachers, entrepreneurs to college dropouts, I saw a common thread in those who kept going. They created a framework for their efforts. However small, however temporary, however impromptu. Some used a paper calendar to track every small step. Some drew progress charts and taped them to the wall. Some formed groups of friends committed not to give up. Some recorded their own voices to play back whenever they wanted to stop. There's no single formula, but there's always a recurring element. They didn't wait for motivation to come before acting. They acted first and let that action become the motivation. One of the most common misconceptions about motivation is that highly motivated people always feel like doing things, but the reality is the opposite. Those who maintain persistent, long-term effort don't necessarily enjoy what they do every day. They also feel tired, fed up, and want to quit, but they still do it. Not because they like doing it, but because they don't like the feeling of not doing it. Researchers call this phenomenon internalized identity. When you exercise long enough, you no longer think, "I have to go work out," but "I am someone who works out." Skipping a session is no longer procrastination, it's an inconsistency with your self-identity. And that very feeling of inconsistency becomes the motivation. Identity doesn't come from declarations, it's created by repeated actions. You don't need to call yourself disciplined. You just need to do something consistently enough, long enough, uniformly enough, until at some point, the behavior becomes the person. As James Clear, author of *Atomic Habits*, puts it, every action is a vote you cast for the person you want to become. But for behavior to become consistent, you can't rely on inspiration. You need a feedback loop, and the clearer this loop, the more the behavior is reinforced. Imagine learning to play the piano. If every time you hit a wrong note, the keyboard lit up red and emitted a harsh sound, you would adjust immediately. If every time you played correctly, a green light appeared and a part of the song played accurately, you'd feel satisfied. This feedback system itself, not natural talent, determines how fast or slow you progress. In studies with people learning complex skills, groups given immediate feedback progressed twice as fast as groups who only received feedback at the end of the week. Our brains learn best when there's an instant reaction between action and consequence. So what happens when we work alone? No one gives feedback. Let's return to a study at Stanford University, where participants were asked to practice problem-solving skills. One group was asked to keep a journal after each practice session, just to record what they did, what the results were, and how they felt. The other group didn't record anything. After 3 weeks, the journal-keeping group progressed significantly faster. Not because they were smarter, but because they created their own feedback loop through self-observation. Feedback doesn't always need to come from outside, but if you don't record your behavior, you'll forget it. And if you forget it, you won't see progress. And if you don't see progress, you'll give up. That's why tracking progress, even just by marking dates on a calendar, has such a powerful effect. In a famous experiment with people wanting to lose weight, the group asked to weigh themselves every morning and record the number, without doing anything else, had better results than the group who only weighed themselves weekly. That simple act of measurement made them notice subtle behavioral patterns, allowing them to adjust their diet and habits more easily. But there's something even more important than feedback: self-forgiveness when you break the chain. Imagine you've been consistently studying for 20 days. On day 21, you give up. The first feeling is often disappointment, then shame, and from there, you abandon day 22 and 23 as well. People give up not because they are weak, they give up because they don't know how to get back on track. When I asked a student in Chicago what made her drop out of school twice but return for the third time, she replied, "I met a teacher who didn't blame me. She just asked, 'Where do you want to start again?' No one had ever asked me that. Before, everyone emphasized what I did wrong. But that teacher's question made me feel like I still had the right to return." I can't forget that answer because it shows something I increasingly believe. The ability to return is what keeps us going, not the ability to never fall. So, every motivational system needs room for failure, not to be punished for breaking a streak, but to be guided to reconnect. Long journeys need bridges back. Sometimes, what helps us maintain a habit isn't strength, but softness when we slip off track. We often think that to sustain long-term effort, we need to create attractive rewards. But rewards don't always work, especially when they come from outside. Bonuses, grades, titles can lead to a psychological phenomenon called the overjustification effect. This is when external rewards overshadow intrinsic joy or value, causing people to reduce their self-motivation. For example, a group of young children was divided into 2 groups. Group 1 was rewarded for drawing pictures, while Group 2 was promised no reward. Initially, both groups enjoyed drawing, but after a while, the rewarded group started drawing less. Why? Because the act of drawing became associated with the expectation of a reward. When the reward was gone, the interest vanished. That's why people who pursue a long journey, artists, scientists, educators, social workers, cannot rely on external rewards. They need a different kind of motivation, a sense that what they are doing is valuable, even if no one else sees it. And to maintain that sense, they often create personal rituals for themselves, small, repetitive actions that hold deep intrinsic meaning. Think of a writer who writes at 5:00 a.m. every morning, makes an identical cup of tea each day, and plays a specific piece of classical music. No one forces him to do this. There's no external reward, just repetition. But it's this ritual that helps him enter a state of deep concentration, where time disappears and writing is no longer a task but a presence. In many cases, motivation doesn't come from waiting for inspiration, but from establishing rituals that help us navigate through uninspired states. I once met someone who worked in end-of-life care. Her job was to care for terminally ill patients, washing them, conversing with them, holding their hands when they had no family by their side. When I asked her how she maintained her spirit every day, she replied, "I always keep a notebook by the bed. Every time someone passes away, I jot down something they once told me that moved me, sometimes just a phrase, a memory, a small habit. That notebook reminds me that I'm not caring for people who are dying. I'm caring for people who lived full lives." The notebook was structure, ritual, and motivation, but it didn't come from outside. It was an internal wall she built for herself so as not to be swept away. Some people build structure for themselves by linking behavior to a principle. For example, I always reply to emails within 24 hours to avoid causing delays for others. Or, I never refuse feedback, even when I find it hard to hear. Principles don't need anyone to enforce them, but once established, they become a scaffold for behavior. I once called it self-legislating. It doesn't make you rigid. It keeps you loyal to what you once believed was important, even when you temporarily forget. Because the truth is, on any long journey, there will be times when you forget. You forget because you're tired, bored, or everything else feels too overwhelming. And if there's nothing anchoring you, you'll drift. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you want to keep going, you need to find a mooring point. And often, that mooring point was something you set up on a day when you were clear-headed. A student I once taught fell into severe depression after a family tragedy. She dropped out of school and didn't contact anyone. Then one day, she sent me an email saying she found an essay she wrote when she was 15. In it, she described her 20-year-old self as someone who knew she wasn't perfect, but still moved forward. She wrote, "I realized that my past self left a message for my present self." Sometimes motivation doesn't come from thinking about the future. It comes from remembering who you once wanted to be. That could be someone who believed in you, a ritual you created, a principle you held, a question you haven't finished answering, a system you built not to force yourself, but to protect the best part of you from uncertainty, from fluctuating emotions, from temporary laziness. Because potential doesn't bloom in inspiration. It develops in structure. There's a paradox unfolding in every selection system, from schools to workplaces. We say we seek potential, but we only look at current performance. We say everyone has a chance, but we build evaluation scales that prioritize those who already had opportunities from the start. And thus, the system inadvertently becomes a sieve, filtering out those who haven't been meticulously prepared, instead of paving the way for them to rise. How many people could have gone far if the system hadn't eliminated them too early? In the US, a study tracking hundreds of thousands of high school students showed that just a few low grades in 9th grade led many students to be categorized as having no college prospects. But many of those students, with the right support, not only got into college, but graduated with honors. Their only weakness was that they developed later than others. The current system has no place for late bloomers, and that's a huge waste. I once interviewed a principal of a public high school in Texas. He recounted that for many years, his school recruited students based on entrance scores. But then, one year, they decided to try something different, recruiting students with average scores but with recommendation letters clearly stating that they were improving rapidly. The result? After 3 years, those students had a higher graduation rate than the initially high-scoring group. What made the difference? The motivation was the same, the circumstances weren't drastically different, but there was a crucial factor. These students believed the school was investing in a future version of them, not judging them based on their current version. Expectation can be a lever for potential or an invisible cage. Imagine you are a Black student growing up in a poor neighborhood. Teachers automatically assume you need behavioral control. You are placed in low-performing classes, given less challenging assignments. You are not invited to participate in academic competitions, and then you start to believe you are not good enough. All of this is not because you are inferior, but because the system has assigned you an impoverished map of your capabilities. This is not a hypothesis. It has happened and is happening. Studies in U.S. education show that Black and Latinx students are less likely to be identified as gifted by teachers, even when their scores are equal. They are also less encouraged to pursue advanced subjects, even when their performance allows it. Not because teachers are intentionally biased, but because potential is hard to measure. And when it can't be measured, people rely on prejudice. Some children are good at languages, but are placed in remedial classes because they speak with a regional accent. Some students are good at math, but are never acknowledged because their handwriting is poor. Some teenagers have excellent critical thinking skills, but are labeled as defiant because they ask too many questions in class. The system is designed to process hundreds, thousands of people at once, so it must have filtering criteria. But if those criteria don't change for each individual, they won't measure change. And if they don't measure change, they will miss potential precisely where it is germinating. In Chicago, there's a program called AVID, Advancement via Individual Determination. Its goal is to support sandwich students, those who are not exceptional enough to be favored, but also not struggling enough to be saved. These are the students who are often overlooked, not worrisome enough, but not inspiring enough. And because no one invests in them, they begin to believe they are not worth investing in. AVID changes that with a simple principle. Assume that every student can excel if given the right support. They are not given lighter assignments, but are taught how to master difficult ones. They are not given an easy pass, but are exposed to challenges. They don't lower standards, they increase scaffolding. And the results come not from a miracle, but from something rarely talked about. The system reorganizes students' beliefs about themselves. There was a boy once described by a teacher in the program as stubborn, passive, uncooperative. But after 6 months in the AVID classroom, he started raising his hand to speak, began doing more homework than required, and started asking questions like, "How can I raise my math grade?" Instead of, "Why is math so boring?" the teacher asked. "What changed you?" the boy replied. "Because here, everyone thinks I can do it." Sometimes a system of opportunity doesn't need to do anything grand. It just needs to reset the default assumption. Modern education is still heavily influenced by a model that measures scores and views them as the sole indicator of ability. But scores only measure ability under existing conditions. They don't measure adaptability, the ability to learn, the ability to change. A study on college admissions showed that if universities only considered standardized test scores, they would exclude almost all students with the greatest potential for long-term growth. This is because those students often have low starting points but steep development curves. And tests don't measure curves, they only measure snapshots. I once served on a faculty hiring committee. Among the applications was a candidate from a lesser-known university with a few unpublished articles. Initially, everyone was hesitant until we read the letter of recommendation. In it, her mentor recounted that this candidate once didn't know academic writing, but taught herself all the theoretical methodologies in just 1 year, then helped edit the papers of the entire research team. She didn't have a flashy resume, but she had something trustworthy, her rate of development. And when we invited her for an interview, she didn't say glamorous things. She recounted her initial failures and how she tackled each one with a system of self-learning. That's when I knew we didn't need someone who was already ready, but someone who had the capacity to become ready. Selection systems, if not improved, will always choose the best person asterisk now instead of the person who will be the best in the future asterisk. And the danger is that the latter group often doesn't get a chance to prove themselves if no one gives them a first opportunity. Look at how many companies recruit. Round 1 via resumes, round 2 via tests, round 3 via interviews. Everything seems scientific, but behind these steps are countless unexamined assumptions. That the smart person speaks fluently, that the right person knows how to pass an assessment, that the trustworthy person has a degree. But in reality, these factors often correlate weakly with actual job performance, and the person with the highest potential index is often eliminated in the initial screening. Leading organizations have begun to change. Some tech companies no longer use a college degree as a minimum requirement. They use real skill assessments, practical simulations, situational analysis, and the ability to learn quickly. Some medical schools are starting to use journey-based assessment techniques instead of just relying on grades. They ask, "What challenges have you overcome? What did you learn from a specific failure? How do you respond to feedback?" These small changes, simple as they are, create a significant shift from evaluating starting points to evaluating the length of the journey. And when you start evaluating by journey, you no longer ask, "Where is this person now?" but "How far has this person come and how far can they go?" In Tennessee, an educational reform took place quietly but had profound effects. The state government decided to reallocate experienced preschool teachers to poorer schools instead of concentrating them in affluent areas. No one expected a miracle. The goal was simply to rebalance pedagogical capacity at the foundational level. 20 years later, a research group tracked the student data from those preschools. They compared these children with a group of students from similar backgrounds who attended schools where no such change occurred and discovered something no one anticipated. Children who had been taught by highly competent preschool teachers not only performed better academically, but also had higher incomes, married later, and were less likely to be arrested. Why would just 1 year of preschool have such a long-lasting impact? Because during that year, children were placed in a structure where they felt they had the ability to learn, the ability to progress, and that someone cared about that progress. In psychology, there's a concept called belief scaffolding. When a child experiences small successes and is acknowledged by adults that it's due to their own effort, they begin to believe that their actions have efficacy. Self-esteem begins with efficacy, not with generic praise. Conversely, if a child only hears, "You're so smart," but doesn't see the connection between what they do and the results, they will grow up with a fragile ego, easily shattered by failure, easily arrogant in success, and quick to give up when not praised. A system of opportunity, if designed correctly, doesn't just provide resources. It creates a feedback loop that is timely, appropriate, and delivered by the right people. More isn't always better. Feedback delivered at the wrong time or in the wrong way can be counterproductive. For example, praising "you're smart" instead of "you're persistent," or saying "you got it wrong" instead of "let's try a different approach." Many schools have adopted feedback methods based on effort and strategy rather than just results. Instead of "this answer is wrong," teachers say, "your thinking is different from this solution. What direction were you thinking in?" This way of asking questions not only helps students understand the lesson, but also maintains their sense of agency in learning. Because one of the first things an unjust system does to people is to make them lose the feeling that they can make a difference. I once interviewed a Native American student. She grew up on a reservation where dropout rates, unemployment rates, and addiction rates were high. She said, "Here, we don't think we'll go far, not because we don't want to, but because we've never seen anyone like us go far." That statement haunted me because it showed that often, the barrier isn't capability but the lack of a model to envision oneself in a different future. That's why mentorship programs based on race, gender, or socioeconomic class where students meet successful people who look like them have such a powerful effect. Such models don't just inspire, they break down a seemingly closed imaginative structure, opening up the possibility that I could be that person too. In a study at Columbia, Black students grouped with teachers of the same ethnicity showed greater improvement in scores and behavior, not because the teachers were better, but because the relationship between expectation and trust was established more naturally. But this doesn't mean that only people from similar backgrounds can help each other. It means that system designers must be aware of the gap between expectation and experience. A teacher who doesn't know that their student has never been trusted cannot understand why that student doesn't trust the classroom. Therefore, the system needs not only to teach knowledge, but to create a vibrant context where trust can be built and spread. There's a school in Oakland that implemented an interesting model. Each senior student was assigned to mentor a junior student, not to teach lessons, but to listen. The older students were trained in asking questions, active listening, and sharing failures. The surprising thing was that after 1 year, both groups had higher scores, with no additional teaching. It was simply the feeling of being cared for and having someone believe that they mattered. And that's what any system of opportunity needs to provide, the feeling that someone is betting on the unformed version of you. If you've ever felt like you didn't belong somewhere, a classroom, a company, a community, you'll understand the weight of invisibility. No one explicitly says you're unwelcome, but you feel like you're wearing an ill-fitting suit, walking on a floor with unspoken rules you weren't taught beforehand. You don't know how to speak correctly, behave correctly, exist correctly, and then you start to withdraw. Many systems fail not because they lack resources, but because they make people within them feel out of place. That's why a sense of belonging is becoming a key factor in every effort to build systems of opportunity. Because when you don't feel like you belong, you won't believe you have the right to develop there. You won't dare to try, you won't dare to ask, you won't dare to make mistakes. In a famous experiment at Stanford University, researchers asked first-year students, especially those of color, to write a short essay describing the difficulties of fitting in. Then, they read excerpts from essays by previous students, which described that feeling out of place was normal and would diminish over time. The result? Just this small intervention significantly increased the scores and retention rates of minority students. They didn't need to change the curriculum, they just needed to change the unspoken message that everyone feels this way at first, and it says nothing about your value. The intervention succeeded because it targeted one of the most dangerous emotions, essentialist isolation. If you think, I'm feeling out of place, that's an experience. But if you think, I'm the type of person who will never fit in here, that's an identity. And when the feeling of being out of place becomes an identity, you stop trying. A system of opportunity must have mechanisms to separate experience and identity, helping people within the system understand that feeling out of place doesn't mean they aren't good enough, but only that the system hasn't done enough to accommodate differences. I once heard an HR manager recount about a female engineer new to a large tech company. After a few months, she sent an email to resign, not due to her ability, but because she didn't feel she had a place. In every meeting, she was interrupted. Every suggestion was ignored. Every initiative was met with a cold response. But no one in the team intended to do this. They simply unconsciously repeated learned behaviors where male voices were heard, while female voices were expected to concur. The manager said something that stuck with me. We weren't trying to push anyone out, but the system we built didn't open the door for them to walk in. So, building a system of opportunity isn't just about opening more doors, but also about re-examining who holds the handle. One company redesigned its employee evaluation process by completely anonymizing those who submitted initiatives. When they did this, the number of ideas coming from minority groups soared. Because now, each idea was evaluated based on its quality, not on who submitted it. In an arts council in the US, musicians were once recruited by listening to them play behind a screen. As a result, the proportion of women selected doubled. The reason wasn't that they played better, but that they were heard correctly. The system, if not adjusted, will default to prioritizing those who resemble existing archetypes, and then it becomes a replica of itself, repeating, narrowing, trivializing. But systems can be redesigned by changing who is heard, who is seen, who is believed. At a school in California, when teachers noticed that students who spoke a native language other than English were often ignored in group activities, they implemented a new technique. Each group had to rotate their leader through each session, and each member had to present at least once a month. After one semester, the confidence and academic performance of the bilingual student group significantly improved. This didn't come from kindness, but from a structure that enforced fairness. Fairness isn't treating everyone the same. Fairness is creating conditions for each person to thrive in their own way without having to suppress themselves to fit a mold. In a world where your past is often used to predict your future, a true system of opportunity is one that dares to reject the pre-existing map. It doesn't see you as where you've been, but as where you're heading. And to do that, it must be flexible enough to ask inverse questions. Instead of, is this person qualified enough? Ask, does this qualification truly measure what needs to be measured? In organizations, many criteria exist simply because they once existed. Entrance scores, years of experience, vaguely defined soft skills, culture fit standards. But when we trace them back to their roots, we discover these criteria are often based on the experiences of groups who succeeded in the past, not on evidence of future potential. A system of opportunity should not replicate a single success model. It should diversify the sources of success. Not every leader needs to be extroverted. Not every innovator needs to be explosive. Not everyone with strategic thinking needs to be articulate, and certainly, not everyone who is good now will be the best learner. An intelligent system is one that knows where it's blind. It accepts that some things cannot be measured by existing tools, so it constantly creates new ways of observing. For example, using portfolios instead of test scores, or behavioral interviews instead of hypothetical questions. In some primary schools in Northern Europe, instead of ranking students by ability, teachers and students collaboratively build personal learning maps, what they've accomplished, what they're trying, and what they want to improve. This transforms the classroom from a place of competition to a place for tracking individual growth, each person on their own journey. Results don't come immediately. But a few years later, students in those classes demonstrate higher persistence, better self-reflection skills, and are less obsessed with mistakes. Because for them, learning is a process, not an assessment. There's a truth few want to accept. Most current systems are designed to select fast people, not deep people. Fast people are often those who have been pre-trained, while deep people need time to manifest. If the system only chases speed, it will eliminate those with depth, and the world will lack those who are slow but steady. Those who learn for a long time, think carefully, and feel deeply. Think about the people who changed entire industries, communities, history. Not all of them were child prodigies. Some were expelled from school, some remained silent for years, some only began writing, creating, leading at the age of 40. Potential has no expiration date, but systems often attach one to it. 18, 25, 30 years old. As if you haven't bloomed in the right season, you'll forever be a dry tree. What I've learned from research, from conversations, from listening is that people develop at their own pace. Some need a push, some need an embrace, some need a major failure to awaken, and some just need someone to believe in them at the right time. Therefore, the best system of opportunity is not one that knows how to choose the right people, but one that doesn't miss those who can. And to do that, it must be designed not to ask what you have already achieved, but to ask who you are becoming.